Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. The Michigan Fiber Festival, Michigan's largest sheep and wool festival, is a vibrant world of fiber arts. Discover 5 days of classes with nationally recognized teachers in spinning, weaving, placemaking, dyeing, felting, and rug hooking. Enjoy 3 days of shopping, delight in shearing and fiber arts demonstrations, and enjoy a truly immersive experience. Join us in August at the picturesque Allegan County Fairgrounds. You can even camp on site. Find more details at michiganfiberfestival.info. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Cecelia Campochiaro explores knitting, even knitting that seems basic, in careful, curious detail. She's the author of 3 books, most recently Reversible Knitting. Well, Cecelia, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's so nice to be here.
So looking at the work that you do in knitting, I've been having a lot of fun exploring your ideas, and I think I see a theme. And the theme I think I see is simple stitches, systematic variations, and really kind of unexpected results. Does that sound like how you see your work, or could you tell me how you see your work?
Yeah, so I think I'm curious, and a lot of stuff in knitting is confusing. And so when I find something is confusing, I just start to dig at it and dig at it and dig at it. And I'm often joyfully surprised at learning new things when I do that, because I really like things to make sense. And you say systematic, and I've even given talks where I've described myself as taking a systematic approach to knitting. But the math of knitting is so brutal that you can't be as systematic as you'd like to be because it gets too big too fast. Now, to really be systematic, you'd like to explore every possibility, but there's so many possibilities that a book would be 100 feet tall in its size to make it truly systematic.
It's so interesting that you say that. I wonder whether there's a lot of complexity that a lot of knitters just kind of gloss over. So when you say that it's confusing, can you think of an example of what struck you as something I need to investigate?
Yeah, I would say, well, okay, there's so many things that are confusing. One thing that is confusing in the stitch pattern world is how one stitch pattern relates to another and how the knitting experience relates to the stitch pattern. And most stitch dictionaries, they kind of start with knits and purls, and some of them even, like the Montricot, I think even starts kind of with ribbing. But most of them just sort of start somewhere, and then it's just this kind of huge outpouring of stitch pattern that aren't in an order. And you don't really see how things relate to each other. And sometimes a stitch pattern looks easy, but when you actually start knitting it, it's really painful. And sometimes it looks really hard, but then you start knitting it, it's not so bad. So I would say stitch pattern dictionaries just kind of dump a lot of information in front of you, but they don't necessarily organize it in a way that makes it comprehensible. So that's one example. I think another example is, stuff like right-leaning decreases and left-leaning decreases, which are always explained in the context of the front side of stockinette.
Yes.
And if you're not doing stockinette, which one works better or worse is actually just not even true. And then the other thing that people don't explain very well is how knitting styles affect how increases and decreases look. And I think it might have been Suzanne Bryan, but finally somebody said something that started to help that make sense, which is when you make a loop with the yarn, you're doing a little micro level of twist or untwist.
Oh,
and so one reason why SSKs never look quite the same as knit two togethers is that you're slightly untwisting the yarn and making it slightly fatter. Well, It's like there's all these little things that affect how things really work. And I've become so sensitive to how knitting style can change the way things look that I've tried to be careful to not make generalizations because a lot of the generalizations are not true. Here's one. Elizabeth Zimmerman in Knitting Without Tears. And by the way, I should preface this with I think I'm more grateful to Elizabeth than any other human in the history of knitting for getting me into knitting and excited about knitting. And she was, in many ways, an engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So she wanted to explain things in a way that was understandable. But in Knitting Without Tears, which I was rereading not that long ago, she talks about, to cast on, you just take 2 needles and hold them together, and you just do basically a long tail cast on over 2 needles. When I do that, I get a disgusting hot mess. I get like these little tight knots with giant loops, and it pulls in too tight and it looks sloppy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have adopted something I call a space long tail cast on, which I do on the right size needle with a lot of tension. And I put spaces between the stitches, and that always has the right width and looks really tidy. But I don't believe Elizabeth was lying to us. I think that the way she cast on and the way I cast on fundamentally led to 2 different results.
Huh.
Have you had experience with casting on and having it look tidy or not?
Well, of course, but I always assume it's me. And what I think is really interesting is that you're talking about not kind of glossing over and saying it's good enough, or I guess that's just what happens, and saying, no, really, why is this that way?
Yeah. And a lot of times it's not the knitter's fault, but there is something about we all take the blame.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the things I know in general that I have confidence in my intelligence and my ability to understand things, that if it doesn't make sense to me, something's wrong. Either I'm not getting enough information to make it make sense, or it isn't correct. And when I was working in business as a manager in high tech, I said to myself, okay, I know I can't understand everything because I've certainly bumped into like math around quantum mechanics that was truly beyond me. So I know I can't understand everything, but most things aren't that. And so I just would start asking questions, so an engineer presents me with something that just sounds like complete gobbledygook. And I'm like, all right, start at the beginning. How does it work? And at some point, I have to get to some level of understanding. And more often than not, there was something wrong. And I think it gave me the confidence just to trust my own ability to comprehend. And I've been really surprised in knitting how much stuff is murky. And I think sweater patterns are just a smoking hot disaster example of confusing and hard to understand. I've still prose sweater patterns, like where you've got all those numbers and you have to circle your size as you go. I can't visualize how they end up, and it makes me crazy. So I've been just starting to teach myself how to do sweaters, and I literally make great big graphs with all the stitches in them so I can see it and then have it make sense. And I go to those prose patterns and I'm like, how does anybody ever get a sweater out of those?
So you said that Elizabeth was an engineer and you mentioned working in high tech. What is your background? Are you an engineer?
I'm not an engineer. I have a graduate degree in physical chemistry. I have a PhD in physical chemistry in a rarefied part of it called spectroscopy. And actually in Europe, that's in physics departments, and in America, it's in chemistry departments. And it's the study of the interaction of light with matter. And it's fascinating. It's really a fascinating area. And I was lucky when I was looking for a job after I finished my studies to land in an industry I'd never heard of, which was called semiconductor equipment. And it's the industry that makes the machines that go into chip factories. And I worked on a machine for many, many years called an inspector, and it inspected wafers of computer chips for defects. And it was actually called a bright field inspector. And my last name, Campochiaro, actually translates field bright, or bright field in Italian. So I always think it was destiny that I spent my life with this machine. But it was really complicated. I mean, it was complicated to design it. It was complicated to manufacture it. It's complicated to set it up. And it had, we had a big team of lots of smart people, but, there were just all these different aspects that you really had to understand. And so I think I came to it with I'm going to have to understand how these parts work, or I can't possibly get anywhere. And I brought that to knitting.
It's so interesting that you have a background in light, because one of your books is about marls. And, for folks who aren't aware of marls, it's kind of holding 2 different colors of yarn together and the ways that changes everything. So Can you tell me a little bit about why you're interested in marls? Do you think that that's connected?
Yeah. So my first book was Sequence Knitting, and that was really all about stitch pattern. And at the same time, in parallel with sequence knitting, I started dyeing yarn and playing, of course, with color mixing with how you dye yarn and playing with something I call fine striping. I call it fine striping when you're doing 1 or 2 row stripes and you can carry the strands up the sides. And you can get some kind of optical effects with that, especially when the colors are close, and especially, like with variegated yarns, all sorts of interesting things can happen. And I played with some marled yarns in those fine stripes. And so I was really interested in different ways you can put colors together and create new things. And I also like the fact that you can put yarns together and make new fiber blends. You can hold a wool yarn with a cotton yarn, for example, and you're striping them. But then, of course, you can also just hold them together and knit with them. And that's marling. And that would be making a wool. You're kind of making a new wool cotton yarn when you do that. And so I just started playing with that in parallel with thinking about stitch pattern. And at some point, probably around 2018, it became clear that that was kind of getting ahead of my next effort on stitch pattern. And I said, okay, I'm going to just plunge into this and really think about how to explain it in a way that other people can. My goal is always to create a book that is a starting point for other people being creative. I don't think I want the book where you're just going to copy exactly what I did, but that you understand how it works. And to your point about spectroscopy and light, for a long time, I'd say better part of a year, I had a hypothesis that I could measure, like I could photograph a yarn and measure its color and its value and its saturation. I could basically measure the color properties of that yarn and predict how it would mix with another yarn when I marled them.
Did it work?
No, it failed.
Really?
Yeah, it failed. And I puzzled over this for a long time. I even thought my photography was wrong for a while. And it turns out that when you put things really close together, you get optical mixing. You see things because photons come into your eyes. And the real aha moment was when I was mixing a cream colored yarn with a black yarn. And I actually talk about this in making marls. And when you hold the cream and the black together and you make a marl, the cream in the marl looks gray. Like the yellow aspect of that cream yarn is gone. And you almost can't believe it was that cream colored yarn that you started with. And all I've been able to really think about is that the black yarn is physically absorbing the light coming out of that cream yarn and changing the way it looks. And if you hold the cream colored stockinette against a black surface, it also goes gray. If you hold it against a white surface, it looks yellow. If you hold it against a black surface, it looks gray. And that was one of the light bulb moments that said, okay, that I couldn't model. I couldn't predict that. Right. And then the other thing is, if you take 2 colors that are exactly the same value, and value means, take a black and white photograph of it, and black is the darkest value and pure white's the lightest value. And the other values are all the shades of gray in between. If you have a red yarn and a green yarn and they're exactly the same value and you knit with them, they will kind of blend into some weird new thing. But the more the values differ, the more they're going to stay separate and the more they're going to kind of be speckly. And it turns out that the camera and the computer are not as sensitive as your eyes.
I was going to ask you about eyes and humans as, as sort of meters, because what you take a picture of and what you can measure may not be the same as what you can see. So it's interesting that you're saying that we're more sensitive.
I think we're more sensitive. And so I started this really a kind of an approach to planning color work with marls I call microswatching, where you make literally little postage stamp size swatches. And what you're trying to do is really see how the colors mix. And in Fair Isle knitting, if you've ever watched somebody planning a Fair Isle yoke, you'll see them take the 2 yarns and twist them and make a little tiny twist. And I know Stephen West has had an approach where he will wrap 2 yarns around a white card. So it's kind of all the same idea. But the reason why I like the little postage stamps is then I can scoot them around and actually create movements like a yoked sweater in Fair Isle, except all in marls. And I call that a marl sequence. And those little swatches give you an idea of how the colors mix. And you can also take them into daylight. You can take them into your evening yellow light. You can put them on a white background. You can put them on a black background, and you can get hints of how they will change in all those different environments. There's a woman named Helen Jongeris. I can't remember her exact name, but she works for the Vitra Furniture Company in Switzerland. And she had an exhibit in London at the Design Museum. And the whole theme of the exhibit was that color is not a static thing. It depends on the way it's lit and the way you see it. And is it a color coming out of a screen with light behind it, or is it a flat color on a wall? And she made these paper vessels with facets, and the light hit the paper vessel. And even though the paper was all the same, it looked like every facet was a different color.
Huh.
And I think sometime in all of that period, I really just said, this is just going to have to be empirical. And the good news about it being empirical is it takes all the engineering, mathy stuff away, and you literally just knit the combinations and see how they look. And you just can't beat that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I like the fact that that's not just for math geeks. I like the fact that that's something anybody can do, and you don't have to feel insecure if you don't like the formula, or don't want to use a software tool to calculate it. I like the fact that it's human scale and it's involving knitting.
That's something that weavers think a lot about too. Weavers think a lot about optical mixing.
Yeah.
Because the interaction of it's probably more like marling, the way that stitches interact in warp and weft, etc., more so than, say, stranded color work where you have distinct stitches.
It's just really interesting. So I have a couple books on color mixing. So the first is Deb Men's, and it's a book on how to spin dyed fiber. And then I have a book called Color and Spinning by, I think, Patricia Lambert et al. And then, of course, there's the own work I've done with marls, and there's work in Fair Isle, which has been a lot of talk of color by a lot of people over the years. And I think it's really interesting. So spinning is the most curious. If you look at fiber and then you see it spun, it's a mind blower how much darker it gets, right? It really changes a lot. I think that's because when you see the loose fiber, there's all kinds of light scattering off the loose fiber. And when you make it into yarn, that light doesn't scatter anymore, and it gets just a lot different. And then in weaving, you get optical mixing because you're really at the thread level of putting the colors together. And there's been a lot of work in the last 100 years, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, where a lot of weavers have actually done like playing with color theory and trying to do weavings that actually use color theory in their weaving. And then marling it depends on the gauge of the yarn, but if you marl lace weight yarns together, which is what I normally do, it's a little bit chunkier than weaving. It's not quite as beautiful and smooth as weaving, but it's smoother than stripes. If you marl worsted weight yarn and up, frankly, I think it's not very pretty. And it's because the flecks are too big and you don't get that mixing, and it just looks like kind of a random mess. But then striping, that 1 and 2 row striping gives you a different level of effect. And Fair Isle is a nightmare. People always say it's so hard. I mean, it's a nightmare to design because take, for example, I forget, I think there's a couple of companies, but I think Jameson's yarn is probably one of the most commonly used, and they have, let's say, roughly 200 colors. Well, you're going to put those colors in a yoke in an order, and they typically will use 12 colors. Well, those 12 colors can be put in, let's just say 12 factorial ways. That's a big number. I mean, it's well over 1 million, right? It's a really big number. Really, really, really big number. And then the thing really interesting about the yokes in Fair Isle is that they have the Peary patterns where you've got, 1 or 2 stitches changing on a row. And then they'll have little blocks of color where maybe you have a rectangle or a diamond that's 3 to 12 stitches wide. Well, the optical mixing for the fine stitches is completely different than for the big. So even if you think about all the possibilities of how you order the color, when a color hits a big area, it's going to be represented differently than in a fine area. So I think it is really tough. You cannot be systematic about planning a Fair Isle yoke. You just have to plunge in and do something.
Yeah. Wow. You have me thinking about all kinds of other things like grist and twist. You talked about worsted versus fingering weight versus lace weight, but then you also have how many plies are there? How much twist is there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. So that's one of my favorite subjects. So I have come to the conclusion that many plies are always better than fewer plies. And I know this is something that, spinners may not always agree with. And part of it is just the joy of making a plump 2-ply. But for the thing that gives fiber durability is twist. Right. If you take a 2-ply worsted or Aran weight yarn, and you put enough twist in it so that it won't pill, and it'll be really durable, it's going to be heavy. It's going to be heavy and really not a very pleasant yarn to put in a garment. But if you have just 6 strands of lace weight 2-ply together, then you're going to get all the drape because the yarn's really thin, and you're going to get the air between those sets of 2-ply lace weight yarns, and you're going to get a beautiful fabric at the same overall weight at the end. So
Right.
the more plies, the better. And the marled is also more beautiful because you're chopping up the color finer and you're going to get nicer mixing.
Mm-hmm. Wow. This is so interesting. I'm sorry. I'm just going to have to ponder. We will move on, and I will ponder at my on my own time. But you were talking about that the math gets really gnarly and extensive.
Yeah.
And I think that's not something I've thought about before, because typically, even if you're working at a pretty fine gauge, when you're working a sweater or shawl, those numbers are finite, but the possibilities are huge.
Yeah, the possibilities are enormous. If you think about knits and purls being like zeros and ones in computers, I mean, look, all the computer world we live in, all its complexity is just zeros and ones.
Mm.
So that's just your knits and your purls are the analogy for zeros and ones. But then you have increases and decreases and yarn overs, and they are not only like another number, and so it's no longer base 2 anymore, it's some more complicated base, but they also are directional. Right. So that's why I say, being systematic, I think is impossible. But again, kind of like the Fair Isle sweaters, the good news is a lot of the stuff that is possible mathematically is irrelevant for knitting.
Right.
Right. Like in sequence knitting, I find that like a run of like knit 12, purl 12 is kind of the biggest I ever want to get. If I were going to knit a sequence that was bigger than knit 12, purl 12, it would have to be something simple with markers, because the brain just can't keep it run straight for much longer than that.
So can you tell me what sequence knitting is? It's one of those things where when I first saw the book, I thought, well, that's so simple. But then the results that you got were pretty extraordinary. So can you tell me what sequence knitting means?
Yeah, so it's a phrase that I coined. And what it means is you take a sequence of stitches and you repeat them according to a rule in a brain dead way. What do I mean in a brain dead way? I mean that you let go of trying to read the knitting and you just do it. And the reason why you have to let go of trying to read the knitting is a lot of times you're building up really complicated textures. And if you try to read the knitting, which usually means knits into knits and purls into purls, you mess up. And one of the rules is 1 row pattern. So every row begins with a sequence, and you just knit the sequence across the row. And that's really simple. One of the rules is you knit to the end of the row and then you work an increase or a decrease. If you end every row on a decrease, you would be knitting a triangle. If you ended 1 row with a decrease and 1 row with an increase, you'd make a parallelogram. And then another rule is just join in the round and knit some sequence in a spiral in perpetuity. And then the last method in sequence knitting was something I called the serpentine method. So if you think about it, knitting a flat piece of knitting, the yarn makes a serpentine path. You knit across the front side, you turn, you knit across the back side, you turn, you knit across the front side. So the yarn is making like a serpentine path with all the little loops for each stitch. And there, the sequence stays with the yarn. So if you get to the end of a row and it's incomplete, you finish it on the next row. And I thought this was going to be a huge game changer in the world of textured knitting, but it's actually kind of hard to do because it's hard for us to remember. We're fallible. And so if you look at sequence knitting, I think the first 3 methods, the 1 row pattern, the parallelograms and triangles, and knitting in the round, have been pretty well adopted. A lot of people make patterns using those ideas. And there were examples before I wrote sequence knitting. You could go find where some of those ideas were used as well. But that serpentine method really wasn't adopted. And so that's been one of the things I've been puzzling on for the last decade is, how do you make more interesting but also reversible fabric? Oh, and then one more point I wanted to make about sequence knitting. So everybody's done it because seed stitches, sequence knitting, 1x1, 2x2, 3x3 rib are all sequence knitting. It's just that those are really familiar ones that are also very readable. Where the magic happens is when the sequence gets more interesting and the rule is different.
It's kind of counter to the first thing, or one of the first things we teach beginning knitters, which is to learn how to read your knitting. And then to say, okay, don't pay attention to the pattern that you're making. Pay attention to, it makes it much more about the whole disconnected, rub your head, pat your tummy sort of thing.
It's true. And I don't know if you've met Carson Demers, but he has a book called Knitting Comfortably. And he teaches that you should actually sit up straight and have your knitting in your lap and not look at your knitting while you do it. And sometimes in my classes, I'll tell people to try that, because I look at my knitting often. So I'm not saying you can't never look at it, but you do have to be careful when you have a multi-row pattern to not knit into knits and purl into purls, which is what beginners doing sequence knitting always want to do.
So, do you make mistakes doing this?
I make lots of mistakes. I feel like I go backwards as much as I go forwards sometimes. And it's partly because I rarely knit in solitude. I'm usually knitting in the evenings when I'm watching TV or when I'm with friends, and I get distracted.
Mhm.
And so I tend to, personally, I like to knit more simple patterns.
Right.
And I'm not a very fast knitter, so I rely on wonderful sample knitters to help me get things done. That's the other problem with knitting is it's really slow. So you can't climb a learning curve very fast if you do all the knitting yourself.
Mhm.
But if you can use sample knitters to help you, you can learn, you can basically multiply how fast you can learn.
So, are you essentially, you mentioned experimenting with the marls and the color, and then you mentioned that knitting is slow. How much of what you're doing is experimental and how much is sort of more in your head?
That's a good question. I think it always starts in your head and you have some little hypothesis or some idea, and then you do the knitting and it either matches what you expected or it didn't. It's always more fun when it doesn't match what you expect.
Right.
Right. Color mixing is something where I teach a class where I have, I bring lots of yarn in different colors and I have people pick colors and make micro swatches. And I'm getting to the point now where I'm pretty good at kind of predicting how things will look because I've been through it a lot. And I think one more thing to say about that, but I still see surprises. I think every class, someone will come up with some combination that I wouldn't have predicted. And it's really interesting. And I like the fact that color is big enough that I think probably even in 20 years, if I'm still here, I'll still be surprised by color mixing.
Speaking of Deb Menz, she taught a lot of spinners that I know, and somebody that I know said, well, I took a class with Deb, and she said at the beginning that there was no such thing as an ugly color, and then at the end, she agreed that I had made an ugly color.
Yeah, I think there's no such thing as an ugly color, but I do think that colors have their place, and so maybe that color just wasn't in the right place. Well, that's something that happens is I have people make a set of micro swatches from base colors. They pick some base colors and they knit all the combinations. And then you can play with how you order all those combinations. And often one or two of them, you kind of visualize a whole sweater in it and you go, ick, I really wouldn't want to wear a whole sweater in this combination, which is more than fair. But it doesn't mean you wouldn't need it with the other colors. It's like in Fair Isle. Do you think about a Fair Isle yoke row by row and edit out, oh, I don't like the mixes in this row. I think that's ugly. No, you knit the swatch and you evaluate the whole. And so I think when if you're spinning yarn and you're making a whole skein in one color, I think that's fair. There's certainly a lot of kind of mousy looking colors muddy, mousy looking colors that might not be winners. But,
right.
But a lot of
let
them,
others pop.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you kind of went from sequence knitting, which you mentioned is often reversible, to a book specifically about reversible knitting. Is that right?
Yeah. So I had a hypothesis right around the time sequence, a book really is finished 6 months before it comes out, at least, because you have to get all the content done so that you can do the editing and have the book made. And I had a hypothesis based on that fine striping that I could do 2 colors with a sequence. I could do 2 rows in color A with sequence A and 2 rows in color B with sequence B. And that by making these 4-row patterns, they would be super easy because you would remember knit 2, purl 2 goes with color A and knit 1, purl 1 goes with color B. And that you can make all kinds of cool patterns from that. And I spent a long time on that idea. And I made triangles and parallelograms and all sorts of stuff. And I ultimately decided it was wrong. They all just look kind of like striped 4-row patterns. The striping put a row repeat on them of 4 rows, and they all just kind of had the same look. And so then it just became, like if you give a mouse a cookie, remember that story?
I'm familiar with the title, but I haven't read the book.
Oh yeah, when you give the mouse a cookie and then it needs a glass of milk, it just kind of goes from there. But so once you start saying, okay, I really want to have a general way to get to reversible patterns, I just kept making my rules broader and broader and broader until it just became reversible patterns in general. And then I really just wanted to have a crack at a stitch dictionary that was all about just making reversible patterns, where that was the goal. Because sequence knitting, became popular because of people liked the fact that the patterns were mostly reversible. So sequence knitting, I think a lot of its adoption was to give people a way to get to reversibility. And then I said, well, what if I just come at it from the other end? I just want stuff to be reversible, and that's my only constraint. And that lets you play with slip stitches and lace and cables and all kinds of fun stuff that was to sequence knitting was already a big book, and it would have been even bigger if it had included those other kinds of stitches. So it was a bigger sandbox to play in, but with a very specific goal of looking the same on both sides.
I really want to come back to looking the same on both sides and lace, but are you familiar with the term yak shaving?
No.
This is a term that I think comes from, I think it was MIT, that my husband, an engineer, uses a lot. And I think it should be more used in fiber. It's one thing after another. It's, you're knitting a sweater and then you have to buy the yarn and then you learn to spin the yarn and then you get some sheep. And the next thing you know, you're shaving this yak.
Yeah.
And so
yak
shaving is
it's the same. That's when I say, if you give a mouse a cookie, that's the same idea. Yeah. Things just grow and grow and grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I also, my first 2 books are big hardbacks, and they're expensive because I'm a small producer and I don't really have any economy of scale. And I really wanted to make a book that people would use as a handbook. I wanted a book people would, if you're going to go away on vacation for 2 weeks, you would take this with you if you wanted to plan your knitting. So I wanted to get it down. And so I did a lot of pretty ruthless editing. So it's not comprehensive. I know there's stitch patterns that could have been in there, but it's pretty comprehensive. And I think it explains the approach so that you can use it again as a launching point and make your own patterns.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of stitch dictionaries are a question of collection. Is that how you see your book?
Yeah, I see it as a collection. So there's a couple introductory chapters, but then the first Stitch Dictionary chapter is on one row patterns. And I think I had a bit of an epiphany in the last few years that there were really a relatively limited set of one row patterns that fell into families. And that chapter is pretty comprehensive. So it's bigger than just a collection. It's pretty close to comprehensive. Mm-hmm. And the next chapter is knit purl patterns. And that's really just a collection because that's an enormous category of patterns. And you just have to have puts and takes to make it manageable. And then as you go further, where you're adding more kinds of stitches like slip stitches or lace, it's even more of just a collection that's, very much biased toward patterns. I didn't put in anything I wasn't willing to knit. So I edited some things out just because they weren't any fun. And I edited some stuff out because I didn't put in brioche or double knitting because I feel like those 2 subjects have been really well presented in other places by people who are just completely immersed in them.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of what we've talked about color mixing, but your first and third books are really kind of about, texture.
Yeah.
How do you see the fabric that you create with these? Is it anything from fine and drapey to thick and chunky? Or I'm just picturing, where I'm getting at is I'm sort of picturing how I would use these. Yeah. And reversibility is important for something like a scarf. Would you use it for something like a sweater?
Yes, I've made a few sweaters, and first of all, I'm always hot, so I really like cardigans more than I like pullovers. And I also think the way a cardigan drapes over the body, it's nice if it can flap open. So I think that for a cardigan, having a reversible pattern is quite lovely. And a lot of the patterns are just beautiful patterns, Yeah. So there's no reason why you can't use them in a sweater. Some of the patterns don't make sense in a sweater. Like, for example, to make a reversible cable, you're going to have the knit cable, which is going to be beautiful. And then you have the purl cable next to it, which just looks like a muddle. Right. But of course, when you flip it over, it looks beautiful. If you were going to knit a sweater in cables, I would just do a plain purl column of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever stitches, and just only have the knit cables presented. There's no point in having all those extra cables in there on the inside of a round sweater. So I think the real use cases are scarves, shawls, blankets, things where both sides really matter. But I also think that for a cardigan that flies open, it can be really lovely. And also, a lot of these patterns are well behaved, meaning they don't bias and curl. So they're wonderful trims. And there's one category of patterns I have in the slip stitch chapter I call wovens. They're all alternatives to linen stitch because linen stitch is not reversible. And like linen stitch, they're somewhat fussy and painful to knit. uh, same as linen stitch, but
Right.
they're reversible. And I think they're really wonderful for edgings, really
Hmm.
beautiful edgings. So a lot of these patterns can be used as edgings. They don't have to be used for a blanket or a scarf.
Yeah. How did you get into all this? Are you someone who felt like I want to do something with my hands or I want to make a sweater? You have taken this in a really interesting direction, and I'm curious where you started with it.
But I started as a teenager and I was in Riverside, California. And a friend of mine's mother was an incredible knitter who would knit my friend, who was tall and slender, would knit her beautiful sweaters. And I had this fantasy, maybe if I would knit a sweater, I'd become tall and beautiful. I don't know. But I really wanted to knit sweaters, but my size and shape didn't fit any of the patterns available. And so that immediately led me into trying to customize patterns. And I also wanted to get done fast. So I was using thick yarn. And so I really spent the first, I'd say, 20 years of my knitting journey like a Sisyphus, working on impossible things because I was making decisions that were kind of impossible. And then I put it aside for a long time because I just got busy. And in around 2000, between 2000 2004, knitting was really coming up again in popularity. And I had a young friend who wanted to learn to knit and, like handed her yarn and needles. And a month later, she came back with a pair of socks, literally. And then she and some other friends and I, we just started going to knitting events. And I just got back into it really gung ho. And in 2004, I took a workshop with Catherine Lowe, who has now become a dear friend and was the editor of my most recent book. And Catherine's a brilliant, brilliant knit designer. And she also makes her own yarns. And she did this 2.5 day workshop that really was taking it down to its most fundamentals and explaining how things worked. And I'd say a lot of light bulbs came on at that point. And that got me on a journey that got me to eventually to sequence knitting.
So you mentioned that Elizabeth Zimmerman is the person to whom you are most grateful. And actually, I first came across your work and really got a little bit more deeply into it when Meg Swanson, who carries your books, said, you absolutely must see this. So you're sort of following in a tradition there.
Well, I'm so grateful to Meg. So when I was in my teens and I was first starting with knitting, I think I had been exposed to Elizabeth Zimmerman at that time because she had a TV show, and of course, if you wanted to get a book on knitting, those were the books that were there. But then in the early 2000s, I like got every book. I read every word she and Meg had written in that kind of 2000 to 2010 period, and I got what do you call it? What do you call them? VHS tapes of her TV shows, and I watched all the TV shows, and really just fell in love with Elizabeth's temperament. And when I published Sequence Knitting, I was working full time, and I had decided to self publish. And distribution and marketing are the problems for self publishers. And there was a company in California called Unicorn Books that was the main book distributor for self publishers in the country. And they agreed to be my distributor. And they were very kind. And then one day they went bankrupt. And I got a letter from a lawyer on a Friday that said, your books need to be out of their warehouse by Monday. And I wasn't sure what to do, but I had an email correspondence with Meg at one point when I was working on Sequence Knitting to ask her if she had ever heard of the technique, or if I was just doing something that already existed that I just couldn't find. So I had her email and I wrote to her with my cell phone, and she called me back within hours and said, we'll be your distributor. And the books went on a truck on Monday to Schoolhouse Press. And so Meg saved me. And it's been really incredible that, my journey from Elizabeth to Meg and her son and daughter-in-law, Cully and Michelle. I mean, they're just incredible people, really.
There's a similar sort of spirit of exploration there about,
Yes.
let's put aside what we think we know and try a little harder.
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot about it. I think Elizabeth really detested purling. She detested purling. She detested seams and she detested purling. And if you say to yourself, I am going to eliminate seams and I'm going to eliminate purling, what can I do? She created a body of work with those two rules.
Right.
Right.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
Right. And she got a lot of yes buts from people, or people telling her she was crazy. And she would figure out some way to engineer around those yes buts. It's really fascinating to me how those two rules led her down a path. And I think when you pick some constraint, and it can even just be some stupid arbitrary constraint, and you just keep that constraint, it'll take you down a path that you otherwise wouldn't have found. That's often fascinating. And in knitting, people repeat the same thing over and over and over again. It's really astounding. And part of it, I learned something fascinating. I was in the UK a few years ago, and I was doing research for this book, and I went to the society, the guild,
Mm-hmm.
Knitting and Crochet Guild. And in Huddersfield, they have their headquarters, and they have lovely, lovely group of women there who run a little archive. And one of them explained to me that they used to teach knitting in school in books, and they would teach techniques that were easy to explain in books, but they weren't the techniques that got the best results.
Huh.
So they taught mediocre techniques, but they taught them consistently over many generations of women.
That's funny.
And so, like, the really good knitting was some grandmother who knew the real technique and would tell the kids, no, 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 don't do that, do this. But we kept losing our institutional knowledge. And I think what's really cool lately is I do think between good reference books and YouTube, a lot of techniques are now being explained in video that could not have been properly explained in prose. And so the level of learning and techniques in the last decade has been pretty extraordinary in knitting. But there's still a lot of repetition. There's still a lot of poor quality web content,
right?
And a lot of repetition even on YouTube. But I think a lot of the work that's happening with the young Scandinavian designers and the beautiful details they're putting into sweaters are just raising the bar, and they're getting away with it because they can make YouTube videos that explain the techniques.
Yeah. We were talking about knitting in a way as having a lot of binary, knit versus purl. And you've mentioned decreases, but of course there's also increases and yarn overs and lace. And so I tend to think of lace as being a whole separate category. Is that something that you can work on reversibility, or is that?
Yeah. So to make something, the way I think about a fabric is I think about it having a ground or a background, and then you decorate that background with fancy stitches. So a yarn over is a fancy stitch, and an increase and a decrease is a fancy stitch. But the knit purl is the underlying ground. Now, garter is reversible. So garter lace is reversible. The only thing you have to think about is, well, garter lace is reversible. Let's just say that full stop. And then stockinette lace typically is not reversible. But if you make the ground ribbing or a checkerboard or any knit purl, if you decorate any knit purl pattern that's reversible with a thoughtful positioning of the increases and decreases, you can make a reversible lace.
Mm-hmm. So do you have to work yarn overs on both sides then? Because
yes,
it's okay, because it's different whether you knit or purl into it.
Yes. You have, the concept of front side and back side dissolve, and you have to treat them both the same to get a reversible result.
So you don't worry so much about, lace knitting versus knitting lace and patterning on the right side and the wrong side. They're all just the right side and the wrong side.
Yes.
Huh.
And I've taught a class a few times on reversible lace, and that's one thing I say is, this idea that you're going to purl back or knit back on the wrong side rows, you just have to let go of that because you have to do stuff on the front and the back.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that people are taking the work that you've done and spinning it out into different designs, or spinning it out into sort of different further explorations? I'm wondering because your books are both very practical and very, in some ways, a little bit more abstract.
I think probably a lot of people have looked at my books and they have learned from them, and it influences their work. And I think a lot of people, in my first two books, there were patterns. They really just wanted to make those patterns. So people come at it from all different levels. Mm-hmm. What I want people to do from like this new book is I want people to either just use the patterns in their own work or their own designs, or adapt the patterns to their own work or their own designs. I really want people to use it as a reference book, as a stitch dictionary. And there's always this reluctance. Oh, is it okay if I use this thing in your book? And that's why you write a book, right? The whole point of writing a book is to get people to use it. So I think there's been some of that, but I wish there was more. And I hope that this book goes farther and wider than the first two books. I tried to make it less expensive and lighter weight and more portable to get more people to just use it the way you use any stitch dictionary.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me, you were talking about how the first 20 years of your knitting, you were sort of doing one thing and hoping that you would get a different result. And I think that a lot of folks working in knitting that has a right side and a wrong side do the same thing. And, if you've been doing it for a little while, you sort of know that stockinette curls or, that everything really curls. But you hope, it's going to block out or, nobody will ever notice. And,
Yeah.
and so that's sort of an answer to that issue of, wishing that the physics of knitting did not apply to you.
Yeah. And okay, there's another piece of this that I find really interesting, which is a resistance to swatching.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And,
Guilty.
you're willing to spend months on a sweater that results in something you don't like, but you're resistant to spending a week or 2 or 3 on a series of swatching exercises that would almost guarantee a successful result in the end.
Mm-hmm.
I see this over and over and over again. And I'm, by the way, I used to do it. And the reason why I used to do it, partly it's cost. There is a cost factor. Like I went and bought sweater quantity of yarn and I can't go use one of the skeins for swatches and then I won't have enough.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really not sensible. It doesn't actually make any sense. And I think a better approach is buy one ball of yarn that you think you might use for a sweater, take it home and do the swatching. And then if your swatching says, this isn't actually what I wanted, then you can buy different yarn and try again. You haven't committed to a huge pile of yarn that's the wrong yarn.
I don't know why we don't enjoy it. And I resist swatching too. And I resist sampling when I weave. And I realize that this is silly. It's like eating too fast or whatever. It's, if this is something I like doing, why don't I spend a little time I'm liking the yarn. I should swatch with it. It's more time to play with it.
I think that if you're getting good results, you're getting away with it, and experience takes you a long way. For example, if you're a Shetlander and you live on Fair Isle and you've already knit 30 Fair Isle sweaters, you don't need to do a whole lot of swatching for your next sweater. You already know the gauge, you know what it's going to do. You've probably got the colors in your mind.
Right.
You're in a different regime, but in American knitting especially, there's so much diversity of yarn. You go into a yarn shop and you've got all these different weights and all these different fibers. And every time you tackle a new yarn, it's a new learning curve. And I tell people, stash diversity doesn't help you. Right? You really don't want stash diversity. You want a very narrow stash because then you get to know those yarns. And if you think about the historic knitting traditions, like think about Bohus knitting or Shetland knitting, people didn't have diversity of yarn. They had one kind of yarn. And they probably had a pretty restricted set of colors. And yet beautiful things came out of that constraint. And I think we have such an opposite situation that it's completely overwhelming. And it really does mean that if you want to make consistent sweaters that have a nice feel and drape that you want to wear, you really do have to climb the learning curve again and again. It's strange times in the history of knitting.
Wow. Well, that's one of the things that's interesting about that is that trying out things like sequence knitting and any of these techniques, using different yarns can give you a totally different result.
Yeah.
So is it desirable to use a different input to get a different result, or is it desirable to really kind of push that farther?
It depends on what you want to do. I mean, let's say you take a very simple, so I love a particular family of stitch patterns called Broken Garter. And they're in the one row pattern chapter in the new book. And they look completely uninteresting there because they're just done in one color. But if you knit them in 2 row stripes, they just wake up and become alive. And they are just gorgeous patterns. And it's really fun to play with different colors, but it's also really fun to play with different yarns because if you have thick or thin or mohair or merino, there's all these directions you can take it. But for me, that's like a sandbox within one stitch pattern. And then I can imagine the diversity of yarn and color. If I want to do a stockinette yoked sweater, there probably the diversity of yarn is not such a good idea. Right. Because there I really just want diversity of the patterning, the color patterning, and the diversity of the colors. And that's plenty of diversity, as we already discussed.
So does that mean that you have a restrained stash?
It's getting there. It's getting more and more restrained. I'm working in a fewer numbers of yarns. And I really do like working with multi-strand yarns a lot. And so a lot of my stash is very thin yarns that I can put together. And there's a few yarn companies that are they really design their yarns with that intention. So I use those yarns more and more.
Mhm.
There aren't very many American yarns that do that, and I wish there were. And all I can think of is I think the small mills have a harder time making really thin yarns. And
Okay,
I think it also costs more to make the really thin yarns because you're, all the time to make, it's more yardage, right? It's more yardage
sure.
in a 50-gram skein. And I think that's why spinners don't make that many super fine yarns either, because it's a lot more work to make them.
Well, I don't know.
I hope
I
I'm
make a
wrong
lot
about
of.
that.
Sorry?
I hear you thinking, and I'm hoping I'm wrong.
Well, I've gotten to the point where if I sort of let my hands do the work as I'm spinning, I gravitate toward finer and finer yarns. And it's true that then I don't get to go play with another fiber sooner, but it's also that 4 ounces of very fine lace weight, you can make a shawl, but it's a little awkward to find something to do with it.
Yeah, it is. But if you think about it as something that you're going to partner with another yarn.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, here's something else I have come to. I like to knit with my needle size between 3 and 4 millimeter.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't want to go below 3 millimeter, and I really don't want to go above 4 millimeter. And so that's my window of happy place. So if I've got a really fine lace yarn, I think about, well, what can I put with it to get it into my window?
Yeah. That sort of restriction. I mean, there was a whole French literature movement, Oulipo, that was sort of based on the same idea. In that case, it was often arbitrary rules, like, can I write a novel without an E? Or can I write a book where no matter where you start, you can go to the end and start at the beginning? Those sorts of, and it was for the purpose of creativity, not just for being difficult.
Yeah, and the reason why I like that window is I don't want to go below 3 millimeter because it really does just get so slow at that point that it just takes forever to get to the end of a big piece. But the reason I don't want to go above 4 millimeter is it's pretty hard to make fabrics with nice drape above 4 millimeter.
That's true.
Right. So there are different reasons why for those two bounds.
Mm-hmm.
I also, I guess that's a real nit, just my personal preference on how needles behave in the hands. I think is also less pleasant above 4 millimeter. But it's not quite the same as writing a novel with no ease. But I think that constraints like that, though, can be wonderful, can lead you to great places. But this is also something you see, like I'd say most sweaters are between 3.5 millimeter and 5 millimeter. And I think, right, in most, maybe 5.5 millimeter, most yarn shops, that's kind of the window. So I'm just a little bit shifted smaller than that. And then I want to, generally speaking, have, multiple strands within that window as well. So my stash is very much geared toward heavy lace weight yarns. Yeah. Where I can put two together and be in that window.
So you mentioned that you basically have to finish a book at least 6 months before it's released. And part of what one has to do after a book comes out is talk about the book, and that takes some time. But is it possible? Are you willing to tell me what you have sort of shifted your attention to now that reversible knitting is between covers?
So that's a great question. So I think I'm a little bit in mourning because I loved working on the book. And when it's done, there's a certain sadness that I've lost that purpose.
Right.
So right now I've done a lot of accessory pieces. I mean, most of my work has been scarves and shawls and accessory pieces. And I live in California. I'm always hot. I live in, I just don't wear accessory pieces very much. So I really want to learn how to make sweaters. And because I'm short and I wear plus sizes, there aren't very many patterns I can just buy. So I'm really, right now, I'm just playing with sweater fitting, sweater architecture, top-down seamless is kind of my selfish knitting right now. And I don't know if that's just going to be a selfish place to be or if it's going to ever amount to anything. And I'm trying to also talk about this book because, I mean, if I don't go talk about it, people won't know about it and then it won't be successful. And I want people to get their hands on it. I want them to use it. And I hope they love it. So those are the two things I'm working on right now. And I kind of noodling on thoughts for the future. And I'm really liking putting stitch pattern together with yarn and color. And I almost think it would be fun just to really dig into that, just that one narrow aspect. And I think one could make some really beautiful books. One of the most wonderful books I think ever done in the history of knitting was a book that when it came out in Sweden, it was called Thought-Provoking Knitting. And when it came out in English, it was called Pop Knitting.
I remember that book. Yes, I believe
Yes.
that Interweave published that book.
Yeah, and it was done by a woman in Sweden named Britt-Marie Christofferson.
Mm-hmm.
And I would personally describe her as an artist, but she describes herself as a knitter. And it's not a book where I actually knit anything in the book, but the book is like so inspirational. You just look through it and it just makes you happy. It just makes you happy to look in the book. And so I kind of think she was exploring how to make interesting fabric with knitting and trying to use simple techniques, but in a way that no one had done before. And it's magical. And I kind of, that just keeps bouncing around in my brain that, is there something that takes some of these stitch patterns I've been playing with and some of these color ideas, and is there a way to marry them that would create something that would be really interesting and inspiring? So those are the threads in my life right now. Is how do you design a sweater to fit atypical bodies, and how do you put color with stitch pattern?
Mm-hmm. It kind of makes sense to explore that, because so much of color work knitting, with the exception of Bohus and I'm sure some others, it assumes that it's on a stockinette ground.
Yeah.
And then there are ways that you try to actually sort of disguise the traits that happen when, so, if you're knitting a ribbed pattern, you'll often come across the direction, work the first round in knit stitches, even if it would call for a purl stitch, because you don't want to see that purl bump.
Yeah.
But then there are some actually kind of cool things that happen with that. Like in the Farm and Fiber Knits spring color collection, you have a very cool knit and purl increase decrease marled shawl. But there's also a project from Kate Larson in there where she deliberately, like most of it is worked in stockinette with increases, but the first round of the color change is always purled. So, playing with not only the texture, but what pops forward.
Yeah, I don't know why people don't celebrate the purl bump more, because the purl bump is, it's the color blender. A lot of slip stitch patterns get credit for being color mixing, but a lot of them are actually cool because of their purl bumps. And I think, people want stripes to look almost like they were cut out of steel, and they want them to look like hard, straight stripes to the point like where the jog becomes a challenge.
Right.
But if you're working stripes in ribbing, first of all, you don't see a jog. But to me, that purl bump is just part of the joy of it. And if the colors are close, it's almost not even there. It's only if you're doing like navy and white where you would really see it. And so I think if you want to do textured knitting and you want to do color work, you need to celebrate the purl bump and you need to celebrate the purl.
Mm-hmm.
They're such an important part of our knitting life that they should not be forgotten.
Do you knit with the yarn in your right or left hand?
I'm a thrower.
You're a thrower.
I took classes on being a continental style knitter,
right.
And I tried for 2 years to knit continental, and I finally just said, it doesn't make me as happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I switched back.
I was curious because I wonder whether people's attitude about purling is different based on how you hold the yarn.
I think it is. And I also have realized that some of the increases and decreases that I prefer are very difficult for people who knit continental style.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one reason why I've been more judicious about my comments about technique, because they're so intertwined with how we knit.
That's true. Yeah.
But I also say that, all the people who did Bohus were all continental style knitters and even did the color work often flat, where they had to handle a purl side as well with 3 colors in one row. So it's clearly possible to purl no matter how you knit. But by the way, one other point about the Bohus, because I want to tie back to the conversation we had earlier about the scale of color mixing. The magic of the Bohus was that they knit this very fine yarn, somewhere right between lace and fingering in its weight, on 2mm needles.
Mm-hmm.
And that very fine yarn gives those patterns a magic that doesn't exist at larger gauge.
The texture of the yarn also makes a difference.
It does. It's got the Angora rabbit in there that also gives it a halo.
Mm-hmm.
But man, when you see one of those sweaters walk by, like at a knitting event, to me, it's just like this little piece of joy moving past me. They're so beautiful.
Yeah. Well, Cecelia, this has been so thought-provoking, and I'm just really excited to keep exploring your work. Thank you so much for your time and for being here.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you. It was a joy.
thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.